Welcome back to the show. Today, I'm sitting down with Sarah McCammon, a national political correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics Podcast. Her work focuses on political, social, and cultural divides in America, including abortion policy and the intersections of politics and religion, and she's also a frequent guest host for NPR news programs. She has covered several presidential elections, including the 2016 campaign, when she reported on the rise of the Trump movement, divisions within the Republican Party over its future, and the role of religion in those debates. McCammon's reportings has documented the growing political power of the religious right, culminating with the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022, efforts by abortion rights advocates to push back, and the rising tide of white Christian nationalism. She's frequently called upon to cover breaking news events and national politics, and her work has won numerous awards, among them a 2023 Edward R. Murrow Award for her coverage of the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision, a 2023 Wilbur Award for religion reporting, a Gracie Award in 2020 for reporting on reproductive rights, and a National Press Club Journalism Award for team coverage of the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting in 2018. She's appeared on numerous television programs, including CNN's Inside Politics, MSNBC's All In with Chris Hayes, PBS NewsHour, and C-SPAN's Washington Journal. And today, I'm going to be talking with her about her book, The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. It is part memoir and part journalism about the movement of people who grew up inside the powerful evangelical subculture and ultimately left in response to its increasing politicization. The hardcover and audiobook versions are available to purchase now through the link in the show notes of this episode, and the new paperback edition is available to pre-order right now and will be available in February of 2025. Here's my conversation with Sarah McCammon. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Preacher Boys podcast. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric.
I feel like this is a somewhat timely interview because I was just reading an ABC News article that was talking about the decrease in attendance of church. And so it was saying that in the 1940s, 80% of Americans said they belonged to a church, synagogue, mosque, or temple, and now only 32% say that they do. As someone who's literally written the book on people leaving their churches, how do you view statistics like that when they come across your screen?
Well, I think it matches what I've observed in the real world and probably what a lot of other people have noticed, which is, even if you're somebody that grew up in church, you might not go anymore or might not go nearly as often as you once did. And I'm going to just say church because certainly in 1940 and even still today, the vast majority, the largest religion in America by far is still Christianity. And it certainly was, 80, 90 years ago. Although that's changing and the country is becoming more religiously diverse, even as it becomes less religious overall. But I think that tracks what we've experienced. And a lot of my friends who also grew up in church are less connected than perhaps their parents were. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that there's some interesting data about the whys, but the phenomenon is it represents a really dramatic change in the way that Americans live their lives. And I think that, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I think that will have and maybe is having some repercussions for our politics, although exactly how that shakes out, I don't think we know yet. But religion and politics have been so intertwined for certainly all of our lives, I think in a lot of people's minds that there's a lot to unpack there.
Well, you say we, and I think this is why your book was so fascinating. As someone who's experienced kind of a similar background to you, we've lived the evangelical church and left the evangelical church. And so we can talk data and numbers, but there's also personal experience. And in your book, you kind of talk about something that I resonate with, which is you didn't have this kind of cataclysmic moment where you're like, I'm splitting off from this. It was what you describe as pulling on a series of threads. What were one or two of those like core threads, or maybe the first noticeable thread you remember tugging on that kind of started this exit from evangelicalism?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. That's also what I found to be true, maybe not for everybody, but for so many people that I interviewed for the book. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is I was kind of seeing conversations play out in public in the last decade or so about this experience of kind of unwinding one's religious beliefs, one's religious background, particularly from an evangelical background, in a way that I think was kind of newly possible because of social media, and it seemed to be kind of catalyzed or invigorated by the political moment that 2016 was, where religion and politics were so, I think, in the forefront in a lot of people's minds, and a lot of people had questions about kind of what particularly it meant to be evangelical. Both outsiders and insiders were asking those questions. So I was seeing a lot of really public conversations about this experience that some people called deconstruction, that I, really didn't have a language for when I was going through it, but this experience of kind of pulling on those threads and asking yourself, well, does this really make sense to me? Is this really what I believe? And, how do I want to live my adult life? And so, no, there's not one thread or just one moment. And I think my book is sort of organized around different themes, kind of loosely organized around different themes of, maybe different threads, whether it's the way that the church talks about women or sex or LGBTQ people or science, and certainly politics. For me, it's hard to say what the earliest thing was. There were always things about church that really meant a lot to me and still do, and that resonated, and that sometimes still resonate for me in surprising ways. But there were also things that didn't add up and didn't resonate and felt deeply uncomfortable and scary and off. And so, I can list just a couple. One of them, as I got a little bit older, was certainly the way a lot of people in my world talked about science. I just got the sense pretty quickly that we were talking about how the world came to be in a way that didn't match the way that most scientists were.
So next time somebody says millions of years ago in a very polite way, you remember what God said to Job, and you say, excuse me, were you there? Can you remember that? Next time somebody says millions of years ago, what's the question you ask? Were you there? What is it? Were you there? Now, I've had boys and girls come back to me and say, well, Mr. Ham, we asked the evolutionists, were you there? And they said, no, we weren't, but you weren't either. What do we say now? Here's what you say. Oh, no, I wasn't there. But I know someone who was, and I have his word. Are you interested?
I also kind of became aware that outside of evangelicalism and fundamentalism, in the broader Christian tradition, there were lots of ways of thinking about that, but that I was sort of being taught a very constrained version. And I had the sense that what I was being told wasn't true, and that I was being asked to sort of dismiss just honest questions that I had. So that's sort of an academic one. That's sort of like a head one. A heart one was more to do with a person who's a really important figure in the book, which was my grandfather, who was really one of the only non-Christian, non-evangelical people I knew growing up, and who, was really, as I kind of came to discover and get to know him, a fascinating person, a really accomplished person, but a person who didn't have the same beliefs that we had, and someone who, came out late in life as gay, which kind of complicated the entire relationship with my family. I had these parents who'd had this evangelical born again experience in the 70s as teenagers and had sort of taken that into their parenting. I came along in the 80s, along with my other siblings, and I think evangelicalism and the burgeoning evangelical culture provided a lot of structure and guidance for them, and meaning and just wisdom in their minds for how to do life and how to raise kids. And at the same time, that culture is telling them things about essentially people like my grandfather that really demonized him. And so I was growing up with this real divide that I think a lot of people see even in the country today, but I was living in it in my home. And that created a lot of cognitive dissonance that, really has, I think, stayed with me through my whole life, and is probably part of the reason that I became a journalist, because I just needed to try to figure out, who are these people that I love, and why do they think such different things, and what do I do with that? So, that was probably the start of it for me in retrospect.
One of the things that's really fascinating for me, and I'm sure, you feel this too, is you have these relationships growing up, and you're sitting under the same preaching, you're reading the same books. And I've noticed a divide among people in my life where there's some of us who I think took messages that I think are positive, like standing up for what's right. The popular thing isn't always the right thing to do, like all those things, loving others like yourself. And then we get to a point where we see the practice doesn't match what's being preached. And then you seem to have other people who grew up in those same environments that took in a lot of the harmful messaging. And they see the way women are treated. They see the way that the system should be set up. And they kind of look to the people who have this kind of hippie-esque perspective of loving others, being kind, and they shun them. Why do you think two people can sit in those same environments and walk away with drastically different moral values and systems? And some can vote a certain way that's opposite of the other. Some can live a certain way that's opposite of the other. What do you think the reason for that divide is?
I mean, this is something that I have thought about a lot, and I'm not sure I even have a sufficient answer. I think I'm kind of obsessed with religious history. And I think part of that obsession is just sort of trying to understand the way that belief and value and ideology shape the decisions that people make and shape, not just individual decisions, but big movements, political movements. And so, I'm really interested in sort of like how we came to sort of think the things we think as a society and therefore as individuals. And, it seems really obvious that, if you read about the history of Christianity and even, the history of religion in the West for the last couple thousand years, it seems really clear that different people have taken allegedly similar ideas and applied them in wildly different ways. And sometimes even people who, we see this playing out in the world today as well. Two people who say they fundamentally share the same faith tradition might be wildly at odds about what that means, even to the point of, sadly, in over a lot of our history, violence. Yeah. And so, like, what is it that makes people think what they think and makes them feel so passionate about it that they want to impose that view of sort of the mystical on other people to the point where they legislate it or worse? I don't know. I mean, at the same time, I think I understand that, societies don't exist without some kind of structure, institutions, some kind of beliefs we can all gather around, right? Like any society that has managed to build anything from a building to a constitution to a legislature to whatever, a court system, those things have to be organized by someone around some idea with some shared consensus about what's important. And so I think religion provides that. And maybe that's why people become so adamant about their vision of what it means, because, it is important. Like I think the project that religion is trying to do is something like that I just described, like a sort of assign meaning to life, create guidelines and principles for living, say, this is right, this is wrong, this is my tribe, this is not. Mm-hmm. And, all of those sorts of boundaries and institutions are necessary for the functioning of societies. But, all of those boundaries and institutions also inevitably sort of cut out certain people, eliminate certain people, sometimes turn people against one another. And so, when it comes to like evangelicals in particular, why do some evangelicals look at their Bible and say the most important thing is insisting that, marriage is between a man and a woman and no one should ever have an abortion for any reason? And other people look at it and go, okay, well, we need to make sure that the government provides more healthcare and more education and more housing, and I think, I know people who hold both of those sets of beliefs and some overlapping within those beliefs. And I think there are a lot of people who genuinely have sort of a philosophy about, speaking about conservatives at least, believe that God made the world a certain way. And if you violate that, it causes problems and a real skepticism of, I think that's sort of the starting point. And so anything that falls outside of those parameters is sort of suspect. And I, why is it though that some people are able to, I've met people who I'm thinking of a friend of mine who was very, very conservative evangelical and then had a gay son. And it, I think she held those anti-gay beliefs because of her religious tradition. She thought it was the right thing. She thought it was what God wanted. But, having someone that she loved, that she was close to, forced her to kind of rethink that, prompted her to totally reimagine her understanding of that issue. And now she, does a lot of wonderful work to reach out to gay young people who might be alienated from their families. That's one response. But, other people respond very differently. And so what is it and I talk in the book about how my parents responded, very differently to my grandpa's sexuality. But I still love my parents. I still have a relationship with my parents. We see this issue very differently, and I think I've made it quite clear how I feel about it. But, in their minds, I know that they think that they are upholding like literally God's vision for the world. Yeah. So it's hard to argue with that.
Yeah. It's kind of the ultimate trump card is like, God said this, and it's one of the things, and I know one of your main focuses in your work is politics, and so it would be hard to tiptoe around that through this conversation. And certainly when it comes to the exodus of evangelicals from the movement, the Trump election, the initial election was a catalyst for many people on their deconstruction journey where, and I was one of those people where that definitely played a large piece in it, where you see this figure running and you saw people posting, it's clear who the right candidate is in this election. But both of those people writing it meant the total opposite thing. It's like some people saw the Trump tape and went, well, clearly as an evangelical with these morals, I will never vote for this man. And others went into it going, well, this is, we're not voting for a pastor, we're voting for president. And they went down this train of thought. I'm really curious for you as someone whose head is in politics. Mm-hmm. Do you see, like, what came first in this? Was it evangelicals and Trump represent a culmination of those values? Or do you think it's something where Trump came on into play and his values kind of filtered down into evangelicals? Like, because I see a little bit of both, but I'm kind of curious from your perspective, what you see like being the chicken and the egg in that situation.
Well, I mean, one of the things I write about is the way that, growing up evangelical in the 80s and 90s, I did not understand that we represented, we meaning that movement that I was growing up in, something like 1 in 5 Americans, depending on which data you look at. It was a huge, maybe even 1 in 4, depending on how you count. It was a huge movement. I mean, really at its peak, like even bigger than like white Catholicism. Mm-hmm. Now that's, I mean, and arguably like the largest religious movement in the country. And yet we felt like kind of an oppressed minority. Like we felt like there was all of this rhetoric about sort of being not persecuted in the same sense that maybe the early church was. Nobody was dying, but the sense that like we didn't have cultural cachet, we didn't have cultural power, that we were sort of on the outs, and that Christian values were on the decline. And those are all ideas that I think Trump really tapped into with his messaging about making America great again. Explicitly talking in the last year or so about bringing God back into America. He famously several months ago hawked that Trump Bible, the God Bless the USA Bible, online with the Lee Greenwood country song lyrics on it, and a couple of founding documents like the Constitution published in the back. And he used a messaging that sounded exactly like the messaging I was hearing growing up from evangelical political leaders, kind of filtered through my parents, people like James Dobson and others in that circle, certainly like Jerry Falwell. And just this idea that like the country was on the decline. We as good Christians were sort of losing cultural power. And that was not just a loss for us, but a loss for God, a loss for goodness and righteousness, and that it was our duty to try to reverse that decline. And so I think it was sort of both. I think there was like a pre-existing feeling among many evangelicals that the country was going the wrong direction, that the culture was being degraded, that the ideas and principles that had held the country together were at risk. Randall Ballmer, who's a historian, and others have done, I think, really interesting work on the ways in which the civil rights movement helped catalyze some of that early alignment between white Christians and the Republican Party, opposition to integration in schools, for example. That wasn't the focus of my childhood at all. In fact, my parents, my mom was like an ex-hippie who talked about, like, she even told me once that, she thought the Democrats were right about one thing, and that was that Black people and white people are equal, and, civil rights were good. But she was still very conservative Republican and very energized by opposition to abortion. as were a lot of people in my church. And I heard much more about those culture, by the 80s when I came along, and the 90s when I was a teenager. I heard much more about opposition to abortion, opposition to same-sex marriage, these kind of, cultural value types of issues. Not to minimize the race issue, but it wasn't the explicit focus of discussion. And I think if you'd asked most people that I knew, there were some exceptions, but most people that I knew would have said something like my mom said, which that everybody is equal and everybody's a child of God. Now, how you apply that when you're a white Christian who's grown up lived your life in a mostly white context, how you apply that, I think, is another question, but that was at least the sentiment.
Yeah.
So, but I think Trump tapped into a really long history, and I don't know how well he understood that history, but he definitely understood that the evangelical base of the Republican Party was organized, powerful, willing to turn out, and there was just an existing network of people that he could influence and did influence. And I have to say, he made a lot of promises to evangelicals, and he delivered on a lot of those promises, right? He didn't just pay lip service to the things that many evangelicals cared about. And I think that's a big part of why they stayed with him, despite all of his, much discussed moral failings or character flaws or whatever people might call them.
I was talking to former Congressman Adam Kinzinger on the podcast a couple months ago. And one of the questions I asked him was, do you think that Trump intentionally started his campaign tapping into the evangelical base, or he stumbled into them and then doubled down? And he basically said that he felt he stumbled into them and then doubled down. Is that kind of your read on it as well? Like he went into it and then, I'm starting to get support from them, let me keep pushing this direction? Or do you think it was like from day one, let me tap into these narratives and fears early on?
I would tend to agree with Kinzinger's assessment. I mean, I don't know exactly. I wasn't in those rooms, right? I know that he, early on courted Jerry Falwell Jr. at Liberty University, got his endorsement in, I think, January of 2016. So, just around the time of the Iowa caucuses. He famously stumbled a couple of times in front of evangelical audiences, but it didn't really seem to matter. When he said like the 2 Corinthians thing at Liberty.
I asked Jerry and I asked some of the folks, because I hear this is a major theme right here, but 2 Corinthians, right? 2 Corinthians 3:17, that's the whole ball game. Where the Spirit of the Lord, right? Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. And here there is Liberty College, but Liberty University, but it is so true. When you think, and that's really, is that the one? Is that the one you like? I think that's the one you like, because I loved it. And it's so representative of what's taken place.
Earlier than that, in the lead up to the 2016 caucuses and primary, when he told an interviewer at an evangelical event, I believe also in Iowa, that he had never asked God for forgiveness.
Kind of a big one.
But have you ever asked God for forgiveness? I'm not sure I have. I just go on and try and do a better job from here. I don't think so. I think if I do something wrong, I think I just try and make it right. I don't bring God into that picture. I don't. Now, when I take, when we go in church and when I drink the mother wine, which is about the only wine I drink, and have my little cracker, I guess that's a form of asking for forgiveness. And I do that as often as possible because I feel cleansed. Okay? But, to me, that's important. I do that. But in terms of officially, I could say absolutely, and everybody, I don't think it's just that. I think in terms of let's go on and let's make it right.
So I don't know exactly how he figured it out, but I think also if he was in those rooms, he was talking to people, and he's I think he's a clearly perceptive person when it comes to how to make a pitch, how to sell an idea.
Yeah.
And so it may be that he stumbled into it, but I gather that he stumbled into it pretty quickly.
One of the things you mentioned like really early on in the book is the reason this generation tends to be, one of many reasons that this generation tends to be slipping away from the evangelical grasp, is that we were raised in a very diverse landscape with social media, with access to literally any perspective that we could possibly find with a couple taps of a few buttons.
Right.
With that said, it seems to me that the messaging from evangelicals and from the religious right would be more dog whistles. Like that's what it's been historically, right? Like civil rights, it was like, let's take them out of the school because they're teaching evolution, or hey, instead of saying this, let's talk about forced busing. And let's always talk about another issue that we know we're talking about race. We know we're talking about these things, but we're going to couch it in something that's economic. Or we're going to couch it in something else. Now it seems like it's literally just let's tweet the most racist or misogynist thing. Why do you think there's been such a push toward like getting rid of the dog whistle and being more bullhorn? Like, here's this really aggressively unagreeable thing. We're going to make that our main talking point as opposed to being more covert.
I don't know. I'm thinking about your premise and whether or not I agree with it. I mean, and there's a lot there, so I'm hesitant to like comment on all of it at once. But I think that Trump actually is Trump himself has really mastered the art of like what I call sort of implausible deniability, like making a statement that everybody kind of thinks they know what it means, and then when he's called on it, he says, I didn't mean that, essentially. Or his supporters will say, you're misunderstanding that, you're exaggerating, you're taking him out of context. I mean, this has happened many, many times. I wrote about it a couple of different times in the 2016 campaign. I think probably one of the most extreme or graphic examples was during that first Republican debate in Cleveland. And I think it was August of 2015 when Megyn Kelly, then Fox News host, called him on some of his past statements about women. And he seemed angry about her confrontation. And later, in a follow-up interview, he said that famous line, she had blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her wherever.
Yeah. She starts asking me all sorts of ridiculous questions. And, you could see there was blood coming out of her eyes, blood coming out of her wherever. But she was, in my opinion, she was off base.
Everybody took that to mean he was suggesting she was hormonal and on her period, very old misogynistic slur. And, when he was called on that, he said, you'd have to be a deviant to think that. I meant that.
I said she was so angry that blood was coming out of her eyes, blood was coming out of her. And then I didn't even finish the answer because I wanted to get on to the next point. If I finished it, I was going to say ears or nose.
I just think that sort of formula plays out again and again and again. He says something that seems to push the boundaries, that people find offensive, that they find shocking. They go, oh my gosh, what did he mean? And then he says, well, you're just taking out of context. I mean, I even saw this in the last rally I went to before the election this year in North Carolina. I was talking to a family that was, very conservative Christian family. Their sons had Bible names, reminded me a lot of the people I grew up around. And the mother, about my age, they were in their 40s, she said she was really focused on abortion. Opposition to abortion was kind of her motivator for almost everything politically. And her husband, I asked him about January 6th and the insurrection at the Capitol. And he just, he said, yeah, Trump made that speech, but I don't think he really intended for things to get out of hand. And I don't really think they were that bad. And, honestly, it was kind of funny when people went into Nancy Pelosi's office. And it was just this sense that, if you were looking at, if people are predisposed to align with Trump politically, they'll hear whatever he says as being essentially okay. Either validating their views or, if it's something that seems offensive, not that offensive. And I don't know if everybody else can do that the same way Trump does it, but I think he has really kind of, again, mastered speaking in this really blunt, kind of visceral way that resonates with people. And that also is almost kind of a Rorschach, that people can make it whatever they want it to be. What that means on social media, I don't know if it's because of Trump or if social media and Trump are just kind of like both phenomena that have sort of existed at the same time or been burgeoning at the same time. But I mean, yes, social media is full of vitriol and ugly language, but I mean, it's too big to sort of, I think, assign a reason to that. I think part of that is just the nature of the medium.
Yeah, I was curious for him specifically because, you look at Megyn Kelly, for example, who she was the object of very clear statement that he made, and that's what's, I think, absurd to people who are on the outside of kind of the sycophant group around Trump, is like, he's clearly saying this, like, that's clearly what he meant. Like, he has a history of saying these things. But even someone like a Megyn Kelly can turn around and become an ardent supporter of a Donald Trump. And that's where I'm trying to bridge the gap, I guess, in my mind, is like, how do you go from being literally the object of this vitriolic statement to a bullish supporter, to where you're platforming and pushing as hard as you can? And I guess it's like, what's that secret sauce that he has uncovered to be able to say these outlandish things that literally, like, the big conversation right now in Republican circles is, who's going to be the next Trump? Like, who's going to be able to garner this same level of devotion and have the same power that Trump has? And I can't wrap my mind around it, like, where it's coming from.
I think a couple things are going on. One is that Trump, for a whole bunch of reasons, has just so completely overtaken the Republican Party, right? I mean, down to even, in many cases, the state party organization level, the national party, but also just rhetorically and sort of emotionally. Like, he's the sort of emotional and rhetorical center of the Republican Party today. And as we've seen, a number of people, including, Adam Kinzinger and others, have tried to oppose him, and nobody has succeeded. Everyone either ends up on the outs with the party, or much more often capitulating, like Megyn Kelly, like Marco Rubio, many people who have been at odds with him in one way or another. I mean, even Nikki Haley, right? I covered the Nikki Haley primary campaign, and, she went from describing Trump as, a mistake and bringing chaos to, getting on stage and endorsing him at the Republican National Convention this summer, only to have him, as soon as he was elected, tweet or post on Truth Social, or at least say publicly that she would not be part of his administration. So, it's not always clear what it gets people. But what is clear is that, at least in politics, opposing Trump gets you, if you're a Republican, gets you nothing. So, that's one piece of it. I think the other piece of it, at least with this election, that I'm still getting my head around, is not to do with Trump, but to do with the Democratic Party. And I think some failures and missteps there. We saw such a dramatic demographic shift among several groups, including, particularly Hispanic males. More than half of Hispanic males voted for Trump this year, in a year when he's promising the largest deportation ever. Now, obviously, all Hispanic voters are American citizens, but many Hispanic Americans have ties to people who are immigrants or recent immigrants. I went to a Hispanic evangelical church right after the election in Pennsylvania, and spent some time there because I really wanted to understand what these conservative Latino voters were thinking about and what made the difference for them. And they talked to me much like the white Trump voters I'd met over the years had talked to me. They talked about cultural issues, concerns about the way that the transgender issue was being discussed on the left, concerns about abortion, and also economic issues. Just the sense that we heard from so many people this election cycle that groceries were just too expensive. It was too hard to get by. And crime. I heard concerns about crime, and specifically, even at that church, crime perpetrated by immigrants. And, of course, we know that immigrants commit crimes at lower rates than citizens, according to analyses by like the Washington Post and so forth. But the message that, for whatever reason, Trump was tapping into, I think, lived experience, real concerns, real fears people were feeling about the security of their finances and their communities. And, I think Democrats didn't succeed at fully hearing, acknowledging, addressing what people were feeling. And so I think Trump, sort of because of his tendency to speak very in an unfiltered way, in a way that a lot of us might see as lacking nuance, he sort of stepped into that void. I don't have any prescriptions for Democrats on what they do about that, but I think it's important to recognize that it's not just one thing. I think it's, Trump fully taking over his party, but also managing to fill a vacuum, sort of for some sort of middle of the road voters who are maybe just more comfortable with that kind of delivery, and more concerned about other issues than, whether or not they think he's nice.
Well, one of the demographics that I think doesn't get talked about a lot is like the Gen Z male population, which I think is interesting in terms of religion and politics. There's a lot of crossover there, is that yes, there is a massive, I shared the stat at the beginning of the episode, but like there's a massive exodus of people leaving churches in general. But
Right.
One of the most religiously engaged groups that's growing right now is young men attending more conservative churches. Women are leaving in larger numbers than ever before. And I also see, as much as we talk about the stereotype of the older white male Republican voter, I'm seeing in my spaces a lot of people that I grew up with who are white, young male, and are very drawn to the conservative messaging of a Donald Trump, the messaging of an Andrew Tate, the messaging of that whole gamut of the red-pilled culture. How do you think, how do you think we reach that demographic? I just see I see kind of the Democratic world, dropping the ball in this area and reaching out to that group. I see the right doing really well reaching those groups and pulling them back into churches. Like, what do you think the reason we're seeing that swing happening is?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. And I haven't done a lot of reporting on young men in particular, but I've read some of the reporting and I think it's fascinating. I mean, young men are going to church now, I think at higher rates than women. I think you just alluded to that.
Which I think is the first time in like recorded history that's been the case. It's always
been
the reverse.
And it's it's young white men, but also, again, a lot of the movement that was seen in the 2024 election among Latino and Black men was among younger men. So there's something, it's interesting to sort of try to tease apart what's gender, what's age. I thought I was just looking at there've been a couple of graphs. I think the Financial Times just published one right after the election. And I think it was either the New York Times or the Washington Post published a similar graph just this week, sort of illustrating visually how each group shifted, right? So like not how they voted overall, but just how much they shifted from election to election. And I think those are so fascinating to see, because you see this huge shift to the right, of course, among Latino men. You see a significant shift among Black men. You see a shift to the left among voters 65 plus, which again, older voters, those are supposed to be like the Republican voters. But this election has upended, and I think it's really a continuation of some trends that we were starting to see 4 years ago, but are really seeing now. But we're really seeing kind of an inversion and upending of what we thought we knew. And I think, a lot of probably my reporting and others over the next few years is going to try to get at kind of why and where does that go? There's been a lot made of the success of women. And it's true, women are getting college degrees and graduate degrees at higher rates now than men. Women the wage gap hasn't totally closed, but it's shrunk quite a bit. And in certain professions, I think it's pretty much gone. And economists still argue about how much of that wage gap is really real and how much of it is because of the types of professions that people choose. I think there are different schools of thought on that. And I'm not an economist, but nonetheless, like that metric is improving. And men are still much more likely to die at work. They are more likely to commit suicide. So there are a lot of metrics that suggest that women are doing better than ever and men are not. And, in a perfect world, men would be like, great, women are finally doing well. And we all get a turn now. But I think I'm a mother of teenage boys. So I think I have a little bit of maybe more empathy for this than I might otherwise, because it's not just an abstraction for me. These teenage boys that I personally brought into the world weren't here. They haven't been here for very long. Yeah. And so they didn't create the systems that have done all of that. And I think a lot of young men are just trying to figure out how to exist in this world that they were born into, which doesn't remove all of the inequalities of the past, but it does mean that, like, for an 18-year-old human being today, male, he's got to figure out how to make it in this world. And I think a lot of them are feeling lost and feeling, the economy's changed so rapidly. The kinds of jobs that you could get without much education don't really exist anymore. And even the ones you can get with an education, I think, are often harder to get. The tech jobs, that industry is changing so rapidly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm just throwing out things that I have observed and seen. I, again, haven't done a lot of reporting on this myself, but I think it's fascinating and I think it's a challenge. And, I guess my personal feeling is that I think it's important to like not wave that off and laugh at it. There's a temptation, I think, particularly for people on the left to say, well, it's young men's turn. Mm-hmm. Men have had it great forever, but like, I don't know if that's moving society forward. Like,
right.
It's a real problem. It's a real concern. And we need to, I think, hopefully figure out how to make things better for everybody. Again, speaking as a mother of boys, maybe I have a little bit of a bias there, but I've also encouraged my boys, like, don't look at professions that are traditionally female. Don't worry about doing something that's like conventional, do something that the world needs, and don't, I mean, I think that is, hopefully that's the world we move into, where like gender doesn't matter as much and everybody has opportunities. But I think there's just a lot of figuring out that's going on now. And so maybe religion provides a structure and meaning for young men who don't find it in other places.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing your perspective and the caveats, but even though you're not an economist and, not someone who's maybe in all of these, your finger is certainly on the pulse more than most. Like, I can sit here and kind of look at politics, but you're in this day in, day out. You're seeing this stuff, you're researching it. So I think it's a really valuable perspective. And if I can ask, if this is too personal, we can skip this question, but I am curious, raising teenage boys in this climate, it is really interesting to me. And I panic when I see, like when I was growing up, it was like, some Ben Shapiro videos were popping up and you could go down kind of this lib gets owned rabbit hole. And, there's plenty of people who've come out of those spaces, but I'm looking at the leadership that men are following, and it's not uncommon to see young men consuming an Aiden Ross or an Andrew Tate, or fill in the blank with these really misogynistic influencers and really just horrific kind of rabbit holes that people go down. And you're seeing that even enter into the comedy scene, which would be a really interesting study to see happen. How are you training your boys to navigate a media landscape that's telling them that you're under attack, that, you need to reclaim this, that the patriarchy of the past is being taken away and this is your nature? Like, how do you even start approaching that as a parent, and like with all the information that you do have professionally? Like, it seems like a really difficult hill to climb.
When they talk to me about it, which if you've been around teenage boys, you'll understand that caveat. It's something we've talked about a couple of times. We've talked generally about the fact that like there is just, and this is something I hope all parents talk to their kids about, which is like information hygiene and sort of being aware of what's a good source and what's not. And so, we talk a lot about the fact that there is so much out there on the internet, and some of it's great and a lot of it is not. And you have to really keep your head about you. I always tell them, try to approach everything, both with your heart and your head. So use your reason. Don't be taken, if you hear something from a YouTuber, like, go check it out, see if you can find a good source. And by good source, I mean a legitimate media publication that has professional journalistic standards for vetting facts. And, yes, the mainstream media doesn't get everything right, but we actually have, entire ethics codes about how we do things and what we do and don't do. So it's better quality of information. If you want to look at conservative and liberal sources within that framework, great, but like, check it out. Universities, government, like, you have to take everything with a grain of salt, but like there's higher and lower quality sources. And I've explained that to them. And then I also say, use your heart too. If you hear something that sounds sort of, exciting or angry or whatever it is that maybe, I think we all can get on social media and get riled up by things like, take a beat and think about, try to imagine what someone's life is like that's not like yours. Always use your compassion. When it comes to like specifically being a male in this day and age, I mean, I've talked to them about, I'm a millennial, so I have it pretty good as far as women in history are concerned. But I've talked to them about even just some of the things that I think have changed in my lifetime, and certainly the generation or two before me. I try to make sure they understand like how recent this level of opportunity for women is. And also some of the challenges, that even just like being a working mom in the Midwest back when there was barely any maternity leave, that's not, it's something that, I can navigate on the scale of human suffering. It's not that massive, but it was, I try to just sort of put the real life barriers and challenges into perspective for them. But I also try to validate the fact that sometimes they don't know like what the world holds for them. That's something that I think all young people go through, just trying to figure out like who you are, what's your identity, who do you want to associate with? And mostly I just encourage them to try to figure out something they can do with their lives that will do some good, and also allow them to make a living. Like, the standards are pretty low. I don't expect them to do anything. I don't know. I try to keep the advice pretty practical, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I think you tapped into something there where it is a normal feeling, especially when you're a young person. That's why there's so many shows. I'm watching One Tree Hill right now. So there's so many shows about trying to find your identity as a young person, and it's like, that's an age-old struggle. And I think that's where influencers, whether religious, political, can step in and say, here's a perfect black and white purpose that you can easily fit into. And it's so much easier than navigating the gray of, what do I think about this, or what is the best way to do this, and how does this affect other people? It gives you simplicity. And I think you even mentioned that in the book. I don't know if it was your quote or someone else, but you say we had it all. Like we had our eternal stuff figured out. We had every category perfectly curated for us. And that's a really compelling thing. Again, whether it's coming from a, YouTube influencer, whether it's coming from a political leader or a pastor, that's a really great carrot to dangle for any generation. Yeah.
And I suspect, and this is partly like imagination and partly I think absorbing things I've heard and read from young men, but I suspect that there's a little bit of nostalgia for like a world in which it was clear like what masculinity meant and what men were supposed to do in the world. But the thing that I've always said is, I think the best form of feminism is actually good for men and women. It should be. It shouldn't be anti-men. It should be about the idea that regardless of your gender, you're human and you're worthy and you deserve to have a well-rounded life. And that means, women shouldn't be reduced to being mothers and wives, as wonderful as that is, for those of us who choose it. But that shouldn't be the only thing available, and it shouldn't be our whole identity. And if you don't choose it, you shouldn't be made to feel less than. Yeah. And men shouldn't be reduced to their role as protector and provider, this traditional role. Although those things are important, particularly if, they're important for men and women. If you have children, you're protecting and providing. But, those things, and I think still, men are more likely to go into jobs like, being firefighters and all of that. And I don't know how much of that's socialization and how much of that is physical strength, and I'm not going to speculate, but I think that's wonderful, and there will probably always be some kind of a gender divide in those kinds of things, but fundamentally I think the idea that men also deserve to have time with their kids, and they also deserve to be valued as people and not just for how much money they make or how strong they are or whatever. And women shouldn't just be valued for their appearance. All of those things to me should be part of a well-rounded sort of holistic view of feminism, and I think should make life better for men and women. So that's my hope. Anyway, that's always been sort of my philosophy, but
it's definitely something that's come up a lot, and it's one of the things that I have tried to say a lot is like historic patriarchy is not good for either party. Like, I think it's the easy answer is it only benefits men. I think the more nuanced answer is it doesn't benefit anybody, because you've got men, especially in evangelical spaces, like when you talk about a John Elridge's book, or you talk about some of these other influences, like you're suppressing pretty much all of your emotions except for righteous indignation, which is not a healthy way to move through life.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that perspective. I'm glad I'm hearing more people talk about it. With that said, that's probably enough about men for now. I'm I'm curious for you, like you mentioned and alluded to throughout the conversation the distrust of mainstream media, and you know, one of the biggest questions I think anybody has that's walking away, like 90% of people who pick up this book are probably ex-evangelicals who are like, how the heck do I better communicate this to the non-ex-evangelicals in my life? How do I show people these systems are bad? As someone who works in media, who has become a figure, media as a whole, where people do inherently distrust mainstream media, they do distrust reporters and journalists and authors talking about these topics. And like, how do you recommend people start having the conversations where we can address some of these negative systems in a way that doesn't just push people deeper into their own system? Like, how do you broach these conversations in a way that's helpful and isn't just met with, okay, let me raise my defenses a little bit more?
Yeah. I mean, maybe this is an insufficiently ambitious answer, but I guess I've always kind of felt like I can't be responsible for how people feel about the mainstream media as a whole. When I'm asked about it, I do try to explain. And often when I give talks, people ask about how we do our work. And I try to explain, because I think not everybody necessarily understands what I was talking about earlier, which is that while news organizations don't get everything perfect, and I think sometimes you can sort of identify an ideological bent for many news organizations. I won't pretend that's not true. There is a big difference between, or there should be, and I strive for there to be, a big difference between journalism that is in the public interest, that is that ascribes to certain ethical and professional standards. Like in my newsroom, we have like sort of an ethics editor, and we have a couple of people who work with him to make all kinds of judgment calls about like everything from what terminology do we use to cover a new issue, like what is the most neutral way to talk about whatever it is, how, what can we as journalists do and not do, like what speaking engagements can we accept and which ones would be a conflict of interest, and all kinds of things like that. I mean, we have pages and pages of a handbook that, we have to read and we have to talk about. And I've served on our ethics committee in the past to try to talk about some of these professional standards. And that's just for my newsroom. Most reputable newsrooms do something similar. And we all kind of, have as a profession, this larger set of principles that we abide by that are taught in journalism schools. So again, I'm not claiming that we do that perfectly. But that reduces a lot of mistakes. That provides a higher quality of information than you would get from, someone who's just sort of blogging in their basement. Not to say that that isn't valuable too. It can be, but it's a different, I always say like social media is great, blogging's great, but like if people are out there talking about the news, it had to come from somewhere, and somebody has to go to the court and get the document, go to the hearing and listen to what was said and write it down. Go to the police and write down what they're saying, record what they're saying, vet what they're saying, see if it even adds up. About a year and a half ago, I think close to 2 years ago, I stood out in front of a federal courtroom in Amarillo, Texas, starting at like 4 a.m. in the freezing cold, not freezing cold, but it was cold, waiting to be led into a federal hearing about the abortion pill, because it was not live streamed. There was no recording in the courtroom. The only way to find out what was going on in there, short of waiting for the court reporter to file their report, which could be days later, was to go inside and sit there and take notes. And this is what we do that's like a very basic version of it, but this is what we do sometimes. We witness history, we document it, and we have standards for doing so. And this is really, really important because I think in the internet, it gets lost. Like we see all this stuff out there and I don't think I'm going on about this too long, but I'm really passionate about it because information quality is really, really important to understand. And like, that's why we do what we do. Now, how do I persuade everybody else to like understand that and care about that? I have no idea, but I try to do my job as well as I can. I try to explain it to people who are interested. And I also try, and I think this is one of the things that's valuable about coming from the Midwest, from a conservative family. Like, yes, I work in, national mainstream political journalism, but I come from a place where I really deeply understand how people think, sort of in middle America. And I know people who hold a wide variety of opinions about politics. And I think that informs the way I talk to people and the way I explain things. And, I'm not the only person that that's true for. I've been really pleased to see newsrooms like the Times, the Post hire journalists from similar backgrounds as mine. And I'm glad that we're part of the conversation because I think, one of the things we can do is hopefully just try to do the basics of journalism in the best way that we can, and just tell stories and tell the truth, and hopefully do it in a way that will make sense to as many people as possible. It is getting harder and harder though, because the information economy is so different than it was even at the beginning of my career.
Yeah.
But I think it's a real danger for democracy. If we can no longer as a society agree on what the facts are, it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, and I think personally, a big piece of that, and I see it because as a podcaster in a basement, who is aggregating from news sources, it's like one of my biggest frustrations that I've been voicing to some other people and including other creators is that media literacy seems to have gone so poorly where, I see people share screenshots from the New York Times calling it fake news because they disagree with an op-ed that was published. And it's like, that's an opinion piece. That's not reporting. Or when someone posts a screenshot of a talking head on Fox and they treat it like news, but like, this is an opinion segment. This is not their general reporter. Like, some of the reporting on some of these networks is neutral, solid reporting, but you're tuning in during 7:00 prime time, watching this figurehead on CNN or Fox and claiming that that's how they actually handle news. Like, just how people consume that stuff is really heavy and frustrating. And it's hard to navigate like how much you dumb down certain information to make it very clear where it's coming from, how much nuance you can interject. And so I appreciate that perspective. And I'm fascinated by people like yourself who have to reach such a broad audience. That's not as niche down as, say, like an opinion show like this, where I'm talking about causes that matter to me as an individual. Like, I think it's a really interesting process, and I'm always fascinated to hear about it.
Yeah. And I mean, there are plenty of outlets that exist to serve a certain audience, left-leaning or right-leaning. We're obviously public broadcasting, so the goal at least is to speak to as broad of an audience as possible. But I think how we do that is, a matter that it requires a lot of thought and kind of calibration all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we're getting near the end of our time here. And one of my favorite quotes in your book was when you said, many of us who've been cast out are surveying the wilderness around us and finding that we're anything but alone. And I was reminded of that going page after page, seeing so many familiar names. I texted Rebecca Drumsta, like when I got to, I think it was like page 50, I was like, oh my God, you're in this. And seeing people who've been on the show, like David Gushee or Linda K. Klein, or like down the list of individuals. And I just want to say, I personally appreciated your book quite a bit. I know my audience is going to as well. And it was just great adding another name to that list of people who are out there critically thinking about where we've come from and where we're going. And so I just want to say before we ended, thank you for your work on this and for crafting what is a beautiful memoir in many ways, but also a really detailed and researched look at this movement. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Eric. Thanks. This has been a really fun conversation. So thanks for your questions and thanks for reading.